Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel today on the case of Nedim Türfent and jailed journalists. And this is a joint panel held by IPI, MLSA, and PEN on the occasion of, unfortunately, it's not very nice, but Nedim Türfent, a Kurdish journalist, is entering his 1500th day in prison today in Turkey. For those of you who do not know Nedim Türfent, he's a Kurdish journalist who worked for the Dicle news agency, which was shut down after the coup attempt in Turkey in 2016. And in that year, Nedim published a news report showing a video where special forces officers were harassing and yelling racial remarks at Kurdish civilians in the city of Yüksekova in Hakkari. And after this was aired, there were some consequences for, at least there was an investigation for the special forces officers. And this took place during operations in Turkey's Kurdish cities in late 2015 and 2016, where many human rights violations occurred during the curfews there. And this was in April when the story came out, and Nedim was later harassed continuously by different departments of the security forces, which resulted in his arrest in October of 2016. He was very swiftly convicted. On the only evidence against him was testimony from 22 witnesses, 21 of whom later withdrew their statements, saying it was extracted under torture. However, unfortunately, he was still given 9 years and 8 months in prison. And today he knows where he's now being held in Van prison. Today he knows we're holding a panel for to mark his 1500th day in prison. And we want to talk a little bit about his case and a little bit about the general situation of Kurdish journalists in Turkey and all of the journalists in Turkey. Today we have 4 guests who are very close observers of Turkish courts and the judicial system. All of them have some of the trials, also outside journalism very closely. I would like to start by briefly introducing them. So today, Nurcan Baysal from Diyarbakir is with us. She's also representing PEN. She's a writer, a journalist, an activist. She's herself is harassed by Turkish authorities and by the judiciary all the time, almost, I think we can say, for her writings. Next, we have Rebecca Harms, a very long time Green member of the European Parliament until last year, actually. And also a very long time observer of Turkey, whom she's somebody we see at Turkish courts as frequently as Turkish court reporters. And then we have Mehveş Evin, who's a journalist and who is today also representing IPI. She is also a long-term time journalist and is also part of several groups that promote freedom of journalism in these difficult times in Turkey. And finally, we have Pete Weatherby representing the Bar Human Rights Committee of the Bar of England and Wales, which is an independent institution promoting and upholding and investigating the state of affairs with rule of law in different countries. So I would like to start with Nurcan, if that is okay, who has been corresponding with Nedim in Van prison, where he's being kept. And so can you please briefly tell us about how did this, his trial happen? What is he going through? And then maybe a little bit about what it means to be a Kurdish journalist working in the Kurdish region.
Again, this week, first, hello to everyone. Again, this week I talked with Nedim's family, and just an hour ago, again, I talked with his sister about how is Nedim now. And we are sending letters to each other in the last 2-3 years with Nedim. And first, Nedim want me to tell you, all of you, that he's okay, and still they didn't hear any coronavirus, in any prisoner that have coronavirus in their prison. And about the Kurdish journalists, maybe I can say that lots of people, especially the pressure on Kurdish journalists began when the peace process collapsed between the Turkish state and the Kurdistan Workers' Party in July 2015. And when the peace process collapsed, as you know, in all over the Kurdish cities, the state declared military curfews. And at that time, lots of human rights violations happened, and the mainstream Turkish media, they closed their eyes on what's happening in Kurdish cities. So mainly the Kurdish journalists who are on the field, they wrote about what's happening on the field, and they wrote about all these human rights violations and the fight going between the youth of PKK and the other human rights violations and war crimes. And then the pressure on Kurdish journalists increased at that time. And I remember lots of our friends at that time, they began to take lots of threats and intimidation on social media. Nedim at that time was one of the cases, and lots of Kurdish journalists at that time put in prison. There are lots of detention cases, etc., etc. And as you ask, Barış, what is it, how it is to be a Kurdish journalist in Turkey? To be a journalist is something hard in Turkey, but to be a Kurdish journalist is more harder, because it is so hard. Even not only the outside of the Turkey, inside the Turkey, it is so hard to make your voice heard, because at the end, the Kurdish society is a colonized society, and there are hierarchies everywhere. So even for a Kurdish journalist, it is hard to make your voice heard by Istanbul or by Ankara. And also, what you are doing on the field is most of the time you are invisible. Lots of things are happening to you, but no one wants to see and want to hear you. It is so hard for you. And from other side, you are dealing with lots of threats, lots of pressures, because it is not, you are Kurdish, but you are also local. So when you are living in local areas, also in the areas which there's violence, it is so hard for you to hide inside the cross. So you are more vulnerable also. Every police knows the address of all of us in Diyarbakir. Everywhere, because every time, now when I see them, I am opening the door of my home because I don't want them to break down my door again. So they know our homes. It is not easy really to hide inside the crops. So they are following, all of your tweets or everything. You are more vulnerable. But from other side, the solidarity mechanisms for Kurdish people, when it is about Kurdish people, it is really more or less. We can't compare it with the rest of the Turkey. And I remember it was 2 years ago, and I was in Frankfurt Book Fair, and I had a speech there. And at that time, I think Ahmet Şık was in prison, and some other people, some other Turkish journalists. And then we are talking about the journalists who are in prison in Turkey. Then I asked the Crow, because it's a very crowded panel, and I asked the Crow if they know about the name of any Kurdish journalist in Turkey who are behind the bars. And no one said that they know any name at that time. So this is the situation of Kurdish journalists in Turkey. And so the pressure began in 2015, increase in 2000. We always had those pressure, but with the collapse of the peace process, it became really very bad. And then on the top of all this, all these curfews and human rights violations, all this, destruction, because from one side, you are writing about the destruction in your own city, but from other side, your house is also destroying, You are inside that war, It is not only just watching and writing. You are inside that society. This is what's happening. They are demolishing your home. They are demolishing your own homeland. And so it is also, you are writing with all this psychology. And then on top of all this disaster, then we have the coup attempt. And then after the coup attempt, everything began worse. What happened in Kurdish cities? First of all, in all over the Kurdish cities, they closed the NGOs. Most of the Kurdish NGOs are closed. And some of those Kurdish NGOs are local NGOs who are also dealing with some, journalism events. And another thing is that state administrations are appointed instead of our elected mayors in all Kurdish cities nearly. And then lots of thousands of teachers and doctors, they are fired from their jobs. And then, all the politicians are arrested at that time in 2016. Yes. And then even almost all Kurdish media were closed, were shut down at that time. Even the Kurdish children channel, Zarok TV, was closed. Sure. Yeah, at that time. And most of the Kurdish journalists put in prison or they left the country. And so also from one side, you have all this pressure, political pressure, but from other side, it is so hard also for Kurdish journalists now to find a job because no one wants to pay also for you. It is another thing. You are under pressure of many things. You are under physical pressure, threat, social, economic, psychological, because what's happening in your hometown, it also affects you. So it is so hard. I want to mention one more thing, especially in the last 2 weeks after the George Floyd event. Lots of people in Turkey, lots of big names, footballers, football teams, lots of writers. They mention about the racism in the U.S., but no one wants to look at what is happening, in Turkey. No one wants to look to the racism against the Kurdish people. This Kurdish, to be Kurdish, it's something really different. Kurdishness is totally criminalized in Turkey now. And so this is what Kurdish journalists, why they are facing all these things. It's not just because of their journalistic work, it's also because of they are Kurdish. And because they think that if you are Kurdish journalist, you have a potential to be a terrorist. So, and when they write all these things that about George Floyd, that when the Turkish people write that, George Floyd, I also wrote that we can't breathe also in this country. As Kurdish people, we can't breathe. As Kurdish journalists and human rights defenders, we can't breathe. But, they don't want to see what's happening inside Turkey. It is more easier, to say something that's happening in the US.
No, I'm glad you drew this comparison because I was actually waiting to see who was going to make the comparison, and you went with it first. But this is true. And a few years ago, actually, a protester in Turkey was an unarmed protester, and he was actually naked from the belly up. So there was even no reason to suspect that he was armed. Was shut down during Nehru celebrations, which is the same thing as Floyd. And we'll come back to your point about solidarity, what you said about mainstream media not, showing enough solidarity, and also this goes particularly maybe for some international institutions as well, or the observers come here, they don't know, it's not because they don't want to, it's they haven't been informed about the situation of Kurdish journalists, and we'll come back to it. It's a very important topic, and what you said about racism as well. But I want to maybe rewind the clock back a little bit before the coup attempt and ask Rebecca so Rebecca, you've been observing trials in Turkey for a very long time. And so combining this with Nurcan's point, do you, with the Kurdish mayors, the recent arrests of politicians and the journalists, would you say that, of course, it did intensify after the coup attempt, but would you agree that there has been a structural, maybe racist, to use probably not a wrong word, structure in the Turkish judiciary all along? And how has it changed over the past few years in the recent trials, comparing with the recent trials you've observed?
So many questions. I'm not sure if I'm able to answer to all your questions. And before I start to try to deliver my answers, I would like to thank all of you for organizing this event, because now already Nedim Türfent is already for 1,500 days in prison. I think it's very important for those who are following, especially from outside of Turkey, what's going on, to really understand how long these prison sentences are going, and to remind each other that we have to take care of those people. And I'm also a fan of the idea to give profile to the journalists imprisoned in Turkey, and to show these cases, these personal cases, and the personal stories behind the general problems which we observe in Turkey. So I think it's a very, very valuable initiative. And my second point sounds maybe a bit as if I would have talked to Nurcan before the panel, because I wanted to talk about what happened in the southeast of Turkey before the coup attempt. This is also something what is not really in the minds of Europeans. So everything what we observe nowadays connected to Turkey in prisons, in courts, so all human rights violations, it's observed to the backdrop of the coup, the failed coup. From my point of view, it's very important, and this is especially important in cases like in the case of Nedim, to know that it started before. Maybe I know more about this because I had the opportunity to visit Cizre after the first curfew. I was together with my friend Cem Özdemir and the German-Turkish journalist Deniz Yücel. I was visiting Cizre, and in September 2015, we, together with some politicians representing HDP, we got the impression, the true impression, shocking impression about what it meant when Erdogan decided that the peace process is over. So I will never forget how shocked I was about the situation in Cizre, about the violence and the fear and also the hate in between Turks and Kurdish people there. But only a few months later, I understood that we saw only the prologue of a huge escalation after Erdogan decided that the peace process was over. And this escalation against the Kurds and against the HDP, so should be mentioned, it was an escalation after first successes of Selahattin Demirtas. These escalation began really the year before the failed coup in 2016. And from my point of view, Nedim Türfent's detention, his imprisonment, is first of all the result of Erdogan's decision to end the peace process. Mm-hmm. And, so it's also the result of this huge purge against all independent journalists after the coup. But first of all, it's still a repression of Kurdish journalists. And it's something what we have to work on. And I'm grateful that Nurcan already mentioned the very, very difficult situation of Kurdish journalists since years again. And so the pressure against journalists and against media, whole media companies, also started before the failed coup in 2016. It started soon after Gezi, or in parallel to the violent crackdown of the Gezi protests. It was first of all economic pressure against media companies and the holdings behind. We then observed searches in media companies, especially also those companies linked to the Gülen movement. Then we saw the beginning of precise, well, not precise, this would be wrong, of indictments of journalists and the first pre-trial detentions. In all the cases against journalists I followed during these years since 2015, the indictments were based on charges, horrible charges. So I have never seen a normal indictment. It was always based on charges like terrorism, support of terrorism, espionage, coup plotting, support of coup plotters, ideas to overthrow the government, and sometimes a very bizarre point appeared in the indictments: the use of the app called Bylog, and the use of an app was used by the prosecutors to prove that their charges of terrorism are right. So it was completely absurd what foreign observers found in those fabricated indictments. Articles, pictures, videos. So the work of the journalists was used to fabricate parts of the indictments. Statements by witnesses, as in the case of Nedim, were result sometimes of pressure, a lot of pressure, sometimes against close friends and families, and the result even of torture. Withdrawal of those statements by witnesses never had any impact, but the cases continued. The Cumhuriyet trial, I think, was for me, especially in this part, very shocking. When I followed in the livre those witnesses from the foundation with their politically motivated statements, which continued also time-wise to an extent what made very, very clear that we were sitting and following, that we were sitting in and following a show trial. Prosecutors in all the cases I followed asked very high sentences, not only many years imprisonment, but regularly. They asked multiple life sentences in solitary confinement, figured out. So international observers got used in Turkish courts to the words multiple life sentences in solitary confinement. It's maybe not complete what I have mentioned here, but based on my personal observations and also many meetings with international human rights organizations, with IPI or PEN International, but also based on my meetings with Turkish lawyers and their international supporters, I'm convinced that the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, ECHR, made a huge, terrible mistake with this assumption that before judges in Strasbourg could act, the applicants from Turkey should go through all instances of the domestic courts. At least one, let's be generous, 2 years after the failed coup, it should have been clear for the European Court in Strasbourg that there is no independent judiciary in Turkey left. There may be sometimes independent judges. There may be single cases. But the judiciary as such in Turkey is not any longer independent. A political prosecution of opposition is the new normal. Only the length of pre-trial detentions breaks records compared to many other countries where we observe human rights violations and weakening of rule of law. Even in the most prominent cases with a lot of international attention, like my colleague and friend Selahattin Demirtas case, or like Osman Kavala''s case, or also like in the case of famous writer Ahmet Altan, no justice, but only politically motivated revenge by Erdogan and his entourage prevails. And so if you want a proof that something is really wrong in Turkey, you can take this recent amnesty law decided in the parliament because of COVID-19 problems in the prisons. Murders and thieves are better off in the consequence of this law. They are released, because of the COVID-19 amnesty, but an elected politician like Selahattin Demirtas, an award-winning writer like Ahmet Altan, and an internationally renowned advocate of cultural diplomacy like Osman Kavala, they remain in prison.
This is very true. Thank you, Rebecca, for this. You gave us, so the picture you give us is a bigger picture. It goes back to before the coup attempt. So we're talking about a country where the situation is worsening, and there have been structural problems focusing the Kurds in general. But this started slowly, especially starting with Gezi, and later on to affect all of the press and media organs, and as escalated after the coup attempt. And yes, this what you said about the exhaustion rule of the Strasbourg court. I think we'll be coming back to that with Pete. This has been an issue. Yes, could it have been any different? Could it have been more helpful in this situation? But what you said, Nedim's arrest being a precursor of what was to come after the end of the peace process, and that is a very yes, the timing. That's a very good point, which is very important for all of us, because it affected not only the Kurdish journalists but everybody who is interested in the region. So, which is which I want to link this to a question to Mehvesh actually. So during the curfews, many of the journalists outside the area were not even let into the region. And journalists from Istanbul couldn't go there to report on the issues. So we needed Nedim's report and other people's, Zehra Doğan and many others, Idris Yilmaz, Idris Sayılgan, many others were imprisoned. I mean, this is a very long list. So my question to Mehvesh is this: how do you, for example, for now, assess the general situation of any journalist in Turkey, right? What, especially not being Kurdish, but wanting to write about the Kurdish question or the region, or any other topic? What are the, how are things going on? What are the red lines for the government? And maybe if you could talk a little bit about the recent onslaught on Oda TV and other journalists. What is your assessment?
All of them together, Barış. That's a long thing, First of all, hello everyone, and I'm sorry I had some connection problems, but I hope you hear me well. So first of all, during the curfew back in 2015, Barış, actually everyone could go to those cities. I mean, there were restricted areas, but those journalists who really wanted to go there, I went there a few times, to Diyarbakir, to another province of Diyarbakir. But the problem was it was a sort of a war situation. And I mean, the planes were landing, but bombs were going off in Diyarbakir. So journalists as well were afraid to go there, and also afraid politically what might happen, because the situation was very, very intense. So yes, people could go there, but as you know, what local reporters, journalists report is of much more importance in such situations. Actually, each time, every time, just also in normal times. Thus, the Kurdish journalists reporting from there was very, very critical. Maybe you mentioned in the beginning, please excuse me if I couldn't catch it. Nedim wrote, he was working for DİHA, Digital News Agency, and he had the footage of security forces handcuffing around 40, most of them Kurdish construction workers, and the security forces were yelling, "You'll see the power of the Turk." Actually, what we are talking about here, about Nedim's case, is yes, he's being Kurdish, he's being a journalist, him being working for Digital News Agency, but especially after this footage, of course, it was on social media, everybody was talking about it, and he got death threats afterwards, directly from the security forces. And then he got arrested, like many other colleagues who were on the field. So I don't want to, if you want to talk about the trial a little bit more, I went there with two other colleagues to the first trial. I can talk about that, but I'll skip to the red lines and taboo part. Of course, red lines, as the Kurdish issue is a red line. I mean, after the peace process, what was so difficult for everyone to understand, especially Kurdish people and also Democrats, liberals maybe, we could just freely talk about the Kurdish issue for a long time, for a few years. And all of a sudden, after actually the 7th June elections in 2015, actually after that, and Ms. Harms really gave a very, very nice feedback about the political climate and what has changed. So it was very hard for journalists to touch on that subject. And of course, after a year after, I have to remind you, we had to renew, I mean, the Turkish government, the AKP government back then, renewed the elections because they didn't like the results back in June. And it was total chaos. It was not only about the curfew going on, bombs were going off, people demonstrating. In Ankara, 100 people were killed, were bombed by ISIS. There were other bombs going off everywhere in Istanbul. We keep forgetting those times, but that year between 2015 and 16 was really, really, I think, the worst in the recent Turkish history. So back to the topics, red lines. Actually, as a journalist, Barış, it's like walking in a minefield. You know, it's there. You know more or less what might cause trouble. Like, for example, writing something pro-HDP. It makes me automatically a traitor as a journalist. Or even not that, even if they don't treat you that harsh, you know that any comment of yours on social media or on some TV show might get you in trouble. But also, please, we have to remind ourselves as well that, for example, writing about the president's wife's Hermes bag might also put you in jail. So there are no clean lines, but you might, when you look as a journalist, who gets arrested, who gets investigated, who gets fined, you get it more or less a view. But then the problem is these lines are changing. And from here, I can switch to the latest trial of arrest of journalists back in March 2020, just before the pandemic hit Turkey and everywhere. If you like, I can just briefly talk about that, or in the next tour. Barış, what do you say?
Please do.
Okay. So, for example, the case of these journalists, they were arrested on charges of violating intelligence laws. They were reported, Oda TV reporter, Hülya Kılınç is her name. She reported on a funeral of an intel officer who was killed in Libya. Okay? It was not reported. It was underreported. But actually an E-Party MP, who is also on the right-leaning side, he gave the name. He made a speech at the parliament. So it was not, it was not about his identity being relieved. And after all, he was dead, and it was his funeral. So Oda TV made this news, just reporting on this funeral, which was saying it was a quiet funeral and so on. And others, like the pro-Kurdish Yeni Yaşam newspaper, they're both editors. They were arrested, and also Yeni Çağ newspaper writer, who is also on the far right, actually, he was arrested as well. So you have a bundle of journalists, 6 journalists in jail, and their first trial will be held on Wednesday. So it's an interesting mix of journalists, and what they want, what I feel, what I hear from the lawyers, they just want to say that they are conspiring against the government. All these different oppositional forces not forces, but journalists this is what they are trying to build. Actually, this is very similar to what happens in politics, because you know that the governing party and their partner, the neo-nationalist MHP, against then there's the opposition. So there's a constant clash in the political scene, and we as journalists are also experiencing it. So better I stop here. Maybe we can go on.
No, thank you for this. So this is actually, combining with what Rebecca said earlier, right? We are seeing basically an earlier tendency of, this coming here, and the operations and after the coup attempt are definitely a watershed event. And then we're talking about increase in crackdown on Kurdish journalists for obvious reasons, but we're also seeing that this is not the only, this is not where it stops, though of course that wouldn't have meant anything, but there's an overall pressure on journalism, where you don't really know what the red lines are anymore. They're constantly shifting. It could be the Erdogan's wife's bag. It could be something else that you write that could get to them. And also we are seeing that now when something is seen as anti-state, you might be where you might be paying consequences for it, even if you're not a Kurdish journalist,
Yes.
more or less in the same way.
But
so
I have to say at this point that Kurdish journalists are much more suffering. I mean, if you look at the numbers, around a quarter, I'm not very sure. The numbers also change, the journalists in prison. But half, or more than half, are said to be Gulenist related. But a quarter is actually Kurdish and left affiliated. So there are different shades of punishing the journalists on where you work and who you are.
No, yeah, I guess that is, I think for all our viewers, it's very clear that Kurdish journalists have this special situation where it is definitely worse for them. And by the way, I just want to have this, we have a list of about 100 people, and of course there are different lists, but more than half are Kurdish on our list. But, that's another discussion. So I want to turn to Pete, and so he has also observed some trials here. He actually represents a lawyering organization, or if I don't know if I'm putting that correctly, but you did observe the Ahmet Altan trial. And later you have observed the Selahattin Demirtas trial, and also of Veysel Ok, our co-director, and so and few other lawyers who have been defending journalists or other people or Kurdish politicians. So I wanted to ask you if what is your assessment of the trial processes that occurred right after the coup, like the Ahmet Altan trial, and those that came later? Is there a tendency, a change going on? And in combination with Veysel's trial, and we had this CHHD, the Contemporary Lawyers, the Jurist Association trial, which I'm certain you followed, and there also another wave of attack coming on for lawyers who defend the journalists that we're speaking about. What is your observation? How would you rate that?
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, the Bar Human Rights Committee has been involved in human rights work across the globe, but very closely involved in Turkey and the Kurdish areas for something like 3 decades. And I've been involved for some years. And you correctly identify some of the trials that I've been at. We're independent legal observers, and we often concentrate on what happens to lawyers and judges, but of course that goes a lot further into due process and into freedom of expression, and hence to journalists. So we've been very keen to follow and be involved with what's happened to freedom of expression and freedom of journalism in Turkey. I think I won't be surprising anyone to suggest that post the coup attempt, Erdogan used it as a pretext to have a fuller assault on journalists, and no doubt particularly Kurdish journalists, but journalists in general. And that has progressed. And I think that it would be right to say that it's got worse, and there may well be further waves, and I think there's been reference to recent arrests made by one of the other speakers. But I want to just make a few comments, if I may, about the Demirtas trial. And I want to do that because I attended, almost exactly a year ago, I attended 2 days of Mr. Demirtas's trial. And that was not very long after the Court of Human Rights had ruled that that Turkey had violated Mr. Demirtas's human rights in a variety of different ways. But most significantly, the court ruled that there'd been a violation of Article 18. Now, I don't want to get over legalistic here, but most people, in fact, including most lawyers, would have to reach for the Google button to actually remind themselves what Article 18 is all about. And that's because rulings on Article 18 are vanishingly few. Article 18 is the prohibition on states limiting other rights. So there are legitimate reasons why states can rein in or exempt themselves, if you like, from certain rights, like privacy, for example. There are a variety of different reasons that the state can interfere legitimately with the right to privacy. But having found that the state had violated Mr. Demirtas's pre-trial detention rights, effectively keeping him pre-trial detention when they shouldn't, the court went on to determine that the reason that the state had violated his rights wasn't simply the actions of some rogue officials. It wasn't some error in the law, but it was because the state was actively trying to prevent a political leader from taking part in the democratic process. And that, as a lawyer looking at Strasbourg judgments and the role of the Court of Human Rights, was a bombshell judgment. And of course, it's one which has been re-argued pretty strongly by the Turkish state before the Grand Chamber. The reason I raise that is because this is the top human rights court to which Turkey is bound and has been a long-term signatory to. And under the rule of law itself, the police investigate crime, they make a case, the prosecutor considers that, puts it before the court on behalf of the state, and then the court, made up of independent judges, or so it should be, they scrutinise and then they determine guilt. So it's not up to the state to do it, it's to do with independent judges. And so the finding in the Demirtas case wasn't just that his rights to freedom of expression or liberty had been violated, but that there had been a proactive campaign by the state to keep him in detention so that he couldn't take part in the democratic process. And what does that mean? That means further that not only the state was involved in doing that politically, not only had they got supposedly independent prosecutors to take part in that, but if the judges were in fact independent, why had they not come to the same conclusion as the European Court had, and ruled that his detention was not justified and was an attempt to silence him? And the only answer to that is that the independence of the judiciary has been so severely reduced, particularly post-coup, that it's now being used largely as a tool of the state to attack its political opponents, whether that be political opponents, or whether that be people in civil society such as Mr. Kavala, or whether it be journalists like the Oltans, or whether it be Kurdish journalists for what they're reporting on, as in Nedim's case. So that's why it's such an important point at the moment. Just taking that one stage further, I don't want to take up too much time just on the Demirtas case, but the 2 points about that is that actually the process that I watched had a repeat. So the prosecution repeated the application that Mr. Demirtas should remain in detention, which had been so heavily attacked by the European Court. And the court issued a very superficial judgment, again, the same as had previously been done and had been criticised by the Strasbourg court. So very depressingly, the court had ignored the Strasbourg decision. However, one of the judges broke ranks and said that if it was simply down to him, then he would have released Mr. Demirtas. So I think that dire though the position is, that we shouldn't just see these processes as binary, and that there are people within the judiciary who may still balk at the attacks on them. But of course, as highlighted in the Alton case and the reports that we wrote and many others wrote about the Alton case, the context of that was the removal of a quarter of the judiciary, a series of administrative and constitutional changes, which had changed the recruitment process for judges, changed the disciplinary process, and had removed due process for issues around the judiciary. So even those judges who want to do their job properly, there is an enormous pressure on them simply to do what the state wants. And that, I think, is fundamentally the problem, looking at it through the eyes of a lawyer. That the judges and the court should be there to uphold the right of free expression, the human rights that are both in the Constitution and that Turkey is obliged under the Convention to uphold. But without an independent judiciary and without a judiciary which is protected, then those rights are illusory. And then you move on to Baysal's case. You know, I came across Baysal in the Alton trial, where he fearlessly, in the early stages of the Alton trial, fearlessly represented his clients under heavy fire from the court. And then what happens to Baysal? He makes what I would say is a pretty mild, compared to some of the things I've said, a pretty mild comment about the independence of the judiciary in Turkey. And he finds himself on an indictment in himself, which could put him in jail, and could have led to his license being taken off him. So if you don't protect your judges, then you can't uphold your obligations under human rights law. And if you don't protect your lawyers, then attacks on journalists, civil society, protesters, politicians they're easy for the executive and for the government and for authoritarians to do.
Well, yes, indeed. The independence of the judiciary seems to be one of the major problems for journalists in place here. And this is well, thank you very much for explaining the situation. And I want to return to everyone a little bit and get a few closing remarks. But about what you said about this Article 18, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's a powerful decision. It's a good decision to come out of the court in Strasbourg. And it actually means that, use different wording, but in non-legal terms, it's basically establishes the fact that Demirtaş's trial is a political trial. Can we say that, Article 18?
Yeah, absolutely. The finding that he was unlawfully detained under Article 5.3 was pretty unremarkable, really, considering the facts. But the finding that by the Strasbourg court, that beyond doubt the state had done that for political reasons, is a finding which has absolutely rarely been made against any state. And can I just, I know we're strapped for time, but just make one comment that on my mission to the Demirtaş trial, I managed to get in, and I'm very pleased I managed to get into the Ministry of Justice, where I spoke to a couple of the judges who worked on the Demirtaş trial for the Turkish state. And they were quite taken aback by the Article 18 finding.
They weren't expecting it.
They weren't expecting it, and they were stung by it. There are many criticisms to be made of the Strasbourg court. I've made many myself, but actually this was a bold finding, and I trust that it will be upheld by the Grand Chamber, although that's not a done deal. But it is a very important finding, and one which is quite challenging for the Turkish state, and it kind of puts them at a juncture where they have to either go with a human rights project, or they have to continue down the road of removing the rule of law altogether. Of course, we've seen the erosion of the rule of law in Turkey, particularly through the journalist trials and the Demirtaş trial, the Kurdish cases. But it is still a powerful tool, the Strasbourg court.
Well, that's an interesting comment. And then, so in closing remarks, this is to, I wanted to ask Rebecca what, so we have a powerful, despite all the criticism of Strasbourg court, which has also come from Turkish civil society as well, it can still be a useful, ally for us. But, we have lower courts not upholding these decisions. Both Kavala and Demirtaş remain in prison. And Turkey passed a justice reform late last year. So I don't know how to word this in a better way, but does Turkey care? Do Turkish authorities, if at this juncture, like Pete said, which way are they more likely to go? How is the current government approaching international pressure, in your opinion?
I have to confront reality, and my evaluation already when I left the European Parliament and so handed over my work in Turkey and on Turkey to the colleagues taking up responsibilities in this new legislature. So my evaluation was that we always have to try to get impact from the side of the European Union or every single member state, especially Germany. We have to try to get impact. But obviously, so far, everybody who tried to influence Erdogan in a better direction failed. This does not lead to the conclusion that we give in and that we don't make our case towards Turkish government. I think the opposite is right. So as long as we completely fail, we are obliged to continue to have arguments. So especially if, like myself, people want that the relations with Turkey are not completely broken. So the difficult process of having arguments and having also so tough arguments with Turkish leadership has to continue. And I would like to add some of my thoughts to this evaluation of Pete on the Demirtas case. Yes, this is a good decision in Strasbourg, but so first of all, it was evident that this is a political case. If a case is a political case, then it's a case in which the court puts in jail a successful opposition leader. Erdogan refused to accept the results of a national election. He went to snap election, hoping that he could get rid of this leader, new Kurdish leader, who wanted really a political solution of the problems in between southeast Kurdish people and the majority in Turkey. And he could not win really what he wanted to win against Selahattin. And therefore, in the end, he was put in jail. And so I was happy with the result in Strasbourg. But on the other hand, I would say there was no possibility for the court in Strasbourg to have another conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Because it was so obvious, right? That it was
so obvious. It's in the cases of the journalists, it's obviously politically motivated persecution. In many cases of political opponents, it is politically motivated. I'm also among those who say that putting into jail thousands and thousands of so-called Gülenists, it's political motivation behind. And Strasbourg, as the most important court for human rights, should not leave any doubts about the political motivation of the purge in Turkey.
I completely support that view. And then, so a few closing remarks, and I want to go back to Mehvesh first, and I'll come back to you, Nurcan. But so Rebecca talked about impact and not giving up, and you are also, working on, announcing the problems with the cases of journalists with the Haberim Var mı initiative, and otherwise you're very active. My question to you is this. Do you think what we're doing is working? Should we be doing it, or should we be, hopeful or depressed, or is there any place for hope, or should we just? What do you think?
Well, we are depressed, but we should be hopeful, right? So yes, with the solidarity, it's getting tougher. Barış, Nurcan would probably also agree on that, especially when journalists are getting criminalized the way politicians do. You were all talking about Demirtas's cases. I mean, it's also another version, also with Kavala's case, the same. So journalists get criminalized. Also, those who have been accused under the same charges or arrested under the same case, like I mentioned before. It's like some of these journalists might not prefer to come together and to take a solidarity stand. So, and at that point, I think other journalists or other, rights groups are doing is very important, because whenever international observers, trial monitoring are so important. Even if you think at some points it's not working, it has some impact, I believe. Mm-hmm. And with the solidarity, it's especially the Kurds are left outside, and especially in those cities outside Istanbul, it's getting harder listen, even in Istanbul, so many journalists are not working for some mainstream media, but those who are interested in covering these trials, be it Kavala's case, be it Nedim's case, the more far away the remote the place is, like a courthouse in Van, where Nedim has been tried and put to jail. It's very hard for journalists to get there. I mean, financially, it's also hard, and to put the solidarity there. And then there's a problem of so many problems coming in at once. So, yes, I believe it is important to be here together on this panel. But I have to remind you that on the mainstream, even on the oppositional view, you cannot hear much of the voices of especially the far left or the Kurdish people. It's like all polarized, like the politics itself. Also, journalism is polarized.
Yep.
So the last point, maybe about the solidarity. So we are just changing. Like there's a group of journalists, like around 50 of us right now, and also other groups who are coming together. And there's a Twitter account. It's at TR Free Press. So these are basically monitoring the trial about the intelligence officer, but I hope also other cases. So please follow them. And there will be a press release tomorrow and the first trial on Wednesday. And the last word, of course, for Nedim, because he is there. When he was put in jail, he was 28 years old.
True.
And now it's been 3 years. He's 21. He's a young man, and he did nothing wrong. I'm so sure of it. I listened to the first trial, like 12 of the statements, the witnesses' statements, and they had no idea. It was like they were put under torture. They had no idea what they're saying. Some of them couldn't read and write. Come on. So it's. I just wish, especially now at this, especially for Nedim and for all arrested journalists, that they be freed soon.
Thank you so much for this message. And Nurcan, and a few closing remarks from you. Do you agree that do you see that solidarity between different journalist groups is increasing? Have we learned anything, especially for Kurdish journalists? Do you feel like what you're doing is producing results, or sometimes are you just exhausted and feel like it's not working?
I think solidarity is very important, very crucial. I know it from my cases, because I am one of the local Kurdish journalists who are relatively lucky, because I was able to establish links with the international institutions, and I know that I am out because of that. I'm clearly saying that I am out because of that, and I still live in Diyarbakir, in my hometown, and if I still hug my children, it is just because of this international solidarity. Because in my last detention during the coronavirus outbreak 2 months ago, they took me to prosecutor's office, and the first day they told me that I am under arrest officially, but because of coronavirus, they are not taking me to prison now. I need to come the other day for the prosecutor. I went, and on the prosecutor's table, I saw all the solidarity messages about me. It was printed and it was on the table from all over the world, from the European Parliament, from everywhere.
Yeah.
And then I understand that it affects the result, and I return home, And the thing is that I think, as I said, I am lucky, but most of the Kurdish journalists are not lucky as me. So is it not time to increase this solidarity? If they can't reach to international institutions, is it not time for us, to establish new mechanisms? Because when I talk with lots of international institutions, they say they should reach us. But if they can't reach, as I talked before, the situation is really so bad. our hometown demolished, our houses are demolished. Lots of thousands of people are still, they don't have house, in Kurdish region. So in all this daily struggle, it is so hard for a local Kurdish journalist to reach these channels. But if they can't reach, is it not time for us to think about new mechanisms? As I said, all your messages, from Brussels, London, everywhere, they affect my freedom. I know I'm out because of that. And I'm still writing because of that, because of this international solidarity. And so we need to hear the voices of Nedim Mor, Ziya Ataman, and the other people that we don't know. The international institutions need to hear the voices of these people, but also we need to hear from you more. There's all these international institutions are establishing their links, by using Istanbul or Ankara, but for local Kurdish journalists, it is so hard for us to reach our voices to Ankara or to Istanbul. So we have this responsibility, to establish new mechanisms to reach to them. As I said, I'm always saying this. I'm clearly saying this. I'm just out because of this solidarity. So sometimes when I talk with my friends, they say, no, what is the meaning? Just sending a message, it doesn't affect anything. It affects. Sometimes, really, sometimes I think that I need to stop. When I see the fear in the eyes of my children, every time when they detain me, I return home. And then I'm thinking that maybe I should stop. But then, a message, just because a message is coming, and just one message sometimes keeps me going on, So it is so important. And I know, as you know, Barış, from Nedim's family, how Nedim is inside, just, he's keeping going on just because of these messages, this solidarity. It also affects all our psychology. And because I know lots of Kurdish journalists, they are at crossroads, especially in this year, every year the pressure is getting higher and higher. Even during the, all these curfews and bombardment in our city, I was writing 3 or 4 articles, in a week. But again, the fear is not so much, But today the fear is more. Lots of journalists, I know, they are hiding. They are changing every day their houses. So it is not easy to keep going on. But your one message sometimes affects our lives. So I think solidarity is not only a word, it is really have an effect in our lives in Diyarbakir, in Hakkari, in Yüksekova, in all these provinces.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. And we've gone over time, but Pete, I'm coming back to you too very briefly. So, do you, comparing Turkey with other countries very briefly, you said earlier that we still have some decent judges, but they can't function as, they should or they ought to under the circumstances. Do you think the Turkish judiciary has the potential to, bounce back after this period? I don't know. Or how is the institutional damage?
I think it's very difficult for any of us, but particularly me from Manchester in England, to comment on how many decent members of the judiciary are left. But I would pick up on the comments that have just been made about solidarity. And we often do things which we think are important, which make no difference. And then we do things which we do only because we've been asked to do them, and we don't think they're important, and they make a difference. It's very difficult to tell which is which. And I think that it's right that all of us from our different directions, whether it's NGOs or as individual journalists or part of journalist groups or independent lawyers, I think we all shine a light into dark corners. And I think it's important that we all remember that the other side doesn't have it all their own way, and they have their own challenges, and that through solidarity, often we can prevail.
Well, thank you so much. Well, so I'll be saying one finishing remark. First off, Nedim will be hearing most of what you said, not hearing, but reading the transcript. So and he's solidarity. Like Nurcan, you said, he's very happy. He knows about all that is being done by PEN, by IPI, and by others outside. He follows everything closely. I wanted to say that, but I wanted to thank you all of our speakers, Nurcan Baysal, Rebecca Harms, Mehveşen, and Evan, and Pete Weatherby for being with us today. And I just want to say that I hope we don't have to have a panel with this title again, but I really would like, I hope that we will be coming together maybe with Nedim on another occasion in a different panel. Thank you very much for your time and joining us. And
Thank you.
and thanks for listening to our audience.
Thank you,
Bye.
Baris.
Bye.
Thank
Bye bye. Good luck, Nurcan.